right, let's dive right into this explainer. We usually think of peacetime as a chance to just catch our breath. But back in 1945, the dust from the Second World War had barely even settled before a totally new, shadowy conflict took over the globe. Today, we're exploring exactly how the end of WWI immediately triggered a high-stakes, decades-long geopolitical chess match between former allies. Here's the roadmap for today. We're going to trace this whole thing step by step, from the sudden breakdown of the WWI alliance to the drawing of the Iron Curtain, the intense battle for Europe, how the conflict went totally global, and finally, what happens when this supposedly Cold War actually turns violently hot. So, starting off with how allies turned into absolute adversaries. To really get why the globe was chopped in half, we've got to look at the incredibly fragile, deeply suspicious partnership of the Big Three at Yalta and Potsdam. The political landscape shifted at literally lightning speed in 1945. First off, FDR passes away and hardliner Harry Truman takes over. And Truman? He had absolutely zero illusions about Stalin. By the time they all met at the Potsdam Conference in July, the tension in the room must have been thick enough to cut with a knife. And then came a pivotal game changer. Truman finds out the U.S. successfully tested the atomic bomb. When he kind of casually drops a hint to Stalin about this massive new weapon, Stalin simply nodded. But behind that nod, oh man, the seeds of a decades-long rivalry were already taking root. It's actually kind of wild to realize this rivalry didn't just pop out of thin air in 1945. There was some serious, deep-seated baggage here. I mean, the U.S. had actually sent troops to fight against the Red Army during the Russian Civil War, and they flat out refused to even recognize the Soviet Union as a country for a whole decade. On the flip side, the Soviets completely rejected the new post-war economic order, boycotting major Bretton Woods systems like the IMF and the World Bank. So without a common enemy to hold them together, that alliance of convenience crumbled fast. Soon enough, they were butting heads over everything from Iranian occupation to atomic espionage. Moving right along to the drawing of the Iron Curtain, let's look at how the geopolitical chessboard was officially split right down the middle with rigid new doctrines and powerful language. Okay, so what exactly was the Cold War? At its absolute core, it was a massive, prolonged, global political and ideological struggle. They called it cold purely because it never escalated into a direct, face-to-face shooting war between the US and the USSR themselves. Journalist Walter Lippmann might have popularized the name, but it was Winston Churchill who gave the conflict its defining metaphor. In 1946, he stood up and famously declared that an Iron Curtain had descended across the European continent. And that brings us to a piece of writing that basically changed the world. Back in February 1946, a guy named George Kennan fired off what's now known as the Long Telegram from Moscow. Writing under the super mysterious pen name Mr. X, Kennan warned Washington that Stalin had absolutely no faith in peaceful coexistence. He didn't mince words, either. He described world communism as a malignant parasite which feeds only on diseased tissue, advising the U.S. to drop the whole partnership idea and start actively confronting the Soviets. And wow, did Washington listen. That advice birthed the absolute cornerstone of American foreign policy: containment. The whole idea was to firmly stop Soviet communist expansion anywhere, and I mean anywhere in the world. We really see this kick into high gear in March 1947. Truman steps up, announces $400 million in aid to Greece and Turkey, two countries feeling the squeeze from communist pressure, and puts containment into action. This was the Truman Doctrine, a firm commitment to support free peoples globally, essentially taking over the massive role that Britain just couldn't afford to play anymore. Next up, the battle for Europe. We're about to see how this ideological clash turns into a totally ruthless economic tit-for-tat over a starving, devastated continent. To put this into perspective, you have to picture the state of Europe in 1946 and 47. It was an absolute crisis. We're talking freezing blizzards, closed factories, and people literally facing famine. Because of this, French and Italian communist parties were surging, snapping up nearly a third of their parliamentary seats. U.S. Secretary of State George Marshall looked at this and realized something incredibly profound. Impoverished, desperate masses are highly vulnerable to Soviet propaganda. Without a healthy economy, political stability was basically a pipe dream. This realization sparked an intense action and reaction dynamic. To stabilize things, the U.S. rolls out the Marshall Plan, pumping a whopping $13 billion into Western Europe. While Stalin looks at this and thinks, no way, this is a capitalist Trojan horse. So he counters with his own financial package, the Molotov Plan. And you see the exact same mirror image escalation with the military. The US and its allies formed NATO in 1949, and the Soviets eventually counter that by forming the Warsaw Pact. Every move met a countermove. But here's the thing, Stalin didn't just hand out money. He aggressively tightened his grip on his Eastern European satellite states. For example, when Czechoslovakia actually thought about accepting American Marshall Plan aid, Stalin dragged their foreign minister, Jan Masaryk, straight to Moscow. Masaryk later described the experience in this chilling way. He said he went to Moscow as the foreign minister of an independent state and returned as a lackey of the Soviet government. It was a violent, stark reminder of just how real that Iron Curtain was becoming. And nowhere was this tension more obvious than in Germany. Basically, the country and the capital city of Berlin itself were sliced up into occupied zones. In June 1948, Western officials introduced a new currency in their zones. The Soviets, they were not happy. They retaliated by initiating a complete ground blockade, cutting off all road and rail access to West Berlin. But the US and its allies didn't back down. They coordinated this massive, round-the-clock airlift, flying in food, coal, you name it, for 11 straight months, until the Soviets finally gave up and lifted the blockade in May 1949. But the damage was done. This showdown officially cracked the country right in half into West and East Germany. All right, stepping into the panic of 1949, let's watch how a border crisis in Europe suddenly snowballs into pure global panic. So if containment was supposed to keep everything under control, the fall of 1949 completely blew that out of the water. First, in August, the Soviet Union successfully tests its very own atomic bomb. This was years, literally years, ahead of what American intelligence predicted. Then, just a couple of months later in October, Mao Zedong declares victory for the Communist People's Republic of China, forcing the Western-backed government to flee to Taiwan. The shocking loss of the world's most populous nation, paired with a newly nuclear-armed Soviet Union, it caused sheer, undeniable panic in Washington. And that panic gave birth to one of the most intense documents of the era, the classified NS-68 memo, issued in April 1950. Drafted by Paul Nitze, who actually admitted he wanted to essentially bludgeon top officials into action, it warned of total annihilation at the hands of the Soviets. It demanded a massive, lightning-fast military buildup to stop the Kremlin from dominating the world. I mean, we're talking about a proposed threefold increase in the annual defense budget. 3 times. This was containment fully shifting into overdrive, which sets the perfect stage for our final act, when Cold Wars turn hot. Because as we're about to see, this massive militarization meant the conflict wasn't actually cold for the millions of people living in Asia. Almost the second NSC-68 was signed, the policy got put to the ultimate test. The UN had already divided the Korean peninsula back in 1948. Then, in June 1950, Stalin gave a hesitant green light to North Korean leader Kim Il-sung to launch a massive surprise attack on the South. This sparked a dizzying, brutal back-and-forth slaughter right across the 30th parallel. First, North Korea captures Seoul. Then, U.S. General Douglas MacArthur lands troops at Incheon and pushes the communists all the way up to the Chinese border at the Yalu River by October. But then, 300,000 Chinese troops flood in, forcing the UN forces into this desperate, fevered retreat. As the war grinds into a horrific stalemate, you get this monumental clash of egos at the very top. General MacArthur is furious, and he actually requests authorization to use nuclear weapons against North Korea and China. Think about that. But President Truman, he is absolutely terrified of sparking World War III and a global nuclear holocaust, so he says no. When MacArthur publicly trashes the president's decision, Truman fires the legendary general right then and there for insubordination in April 1951. The fighting just dragged on and on until they finally signed an armistice in July 1953. But the cost was staggering. Millions, literally millions of Korean soldiers and civilians wiped out alongside more than 30,000 Americans. It's this incredibly dark irony, right? We call it the Cold War, but for those fighting on the front lines, it was devastatingly hot. And tragically, we saw this exact same pattern repeat itself in Vietnam. Here's a wild fact. During World War II, the U.S. actually supported the nationalist leader Ho Chi Minh against the Japanese. But once the Cold War logic took over, the U.S. totally pivoted and backed France's colonial claims instead. When the French got completely routed in 1954, Vietnam was partitioned. The U.S. started sending in weapons, then advisors, and eventually over 500,000 troops. In the end, nearly 60,000 American lives and countless Vietnamese lives were sacrificed in the attempt to stifle communist expansion. So, As we wrap up this explainer, we really need to take a hard look at the world around us right now. From massive alliances like NATO to the UN to heavily militarized borders in Asia, the decisions made in the chaotic aftermath of World War II literally drew the map we still live on today. So I'll leave you with this question. When you look at modern flashpoints involving global trade and military expansion, how do those dividing lines drawn way back in 1945 still dictate our headlines right now? The Cold War might be officially over, but its architectural framework is still very much intact. Thanks for hanging out with me for this deep dive. Keep asking those big questions, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.